And since I am already down there in supplication on the floor, let me hold that position as I reach back in time 3 years earlier to the moment when this entire story began. A moment which also found me in this exact same position, on my knees, on a floor, praying. Everything else about the 3 years ago scene was different, though. That time I was not in Rome, but in the upstairs bathroom of the big house in the suburbs of New York, which I had recently purchased with my husband. It was a cold November, around 3 o'clock in the morning. My husband was sleeping in our bed. I was hiding in the bathroom for something like the 47th consecutive night, and just as during all those nights before, I was sobbing so hard, in fact, that a great lake of tears and snot was spreading before me on the bathroom tiles. A veritable lake inferior, if you will, of all my shame and fear and confusion and grief. I don't want to be married anymore. I was trying so hard not to know this, but the truth kept insisting itself to me. I don't want to be married anymore. I don't want to live in this big house. I don't want to have a baby. But I was supposed to want to have a baby. I was 31 years old. My husband and I, who had been together for 8 years, married for 6, had built our entire life around the common expectation that after passing the doddering old age of 30, I would want to settle down and have children. By then, we mutually anticipated I would have grown weary of traveling and would be happy to live in a big, busy household full of children and homemade quilts, with a garden in the backyard and a cozy stew bubbling on the stovetop. The fact that this was a fairly accurate portrait of my own mother is a quick indicator of how difficult it once was for me to tell the difference between myself and the powerful woman who had raised me. But I didn't, as I was appalled to be finding out, want any of these things. Instead, as my 20s had come to a close, that deadline of 30 had loomed over me like a death sentence, and I discovered that I did not want to be pregnant. I kept wanting to have a baby, but it didn't happen, and I know what it feels like to want something, believe me. I well know what desire feels like, but it wasn't there. Moreover, I couldn't stop thinking about what my sister had said to me once as she was breastfeeding her firstborn. Having a baby is like getting a tattoo on your face. You really need to be certain it's what you want before you commit. How could I turn back now, though? Everything was in place. This was supposed to be the year. In fact, we'd been trying to get pregnant for a few months already, but nothing had happened, aside from the fact that in an almost sarcastic mockery of pregnancy, I was experiencing psychosomatic morning sickness, nervously throwing up my breakfast every day. And every month when I got my period, I would find myself whispering furtively in the bathroom, "Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you for giving me one more month to live." I've been attempting to convince myself that this was normal. All women must feel this way when they're trying to get pregnant, I decided. Ambivalent was the word I used, avoiding the much more accurate description, utterly consumed with dread. I was trying to convince myself that my feelings were customary, despite all evidence to the contrary, such as the acquaintance I'd run into last week who just discovered that she was pregnant for the first time. After spending 2 years and a king's ransom in fertility treatments, she was ecstatic. She had wanted to be a mother forever, she told me. She admitted she'd been secretly buying baby clothes for years and hiding them under the bed where her husband wouldn't find them. I saw the joy in her face and I recognized it. This was the exact joy my own face had radiated last spring, the day I discovered that the magazine I work for was going to send me on assignment to New Zealand to write an article about the search for giant squid. And I thought, until I can feel as ecstatic about having a baby as I felt about going to New Zealand to search for a giant squid, I cannot have a baby. I don't want to be married anymore. In daylight hours, I refused that thought, but at night it would consume me. What a catastrophe. How could I be such a criminal jerk as to proceed this deep into a marriage only to leave it? We'd only just bought this house a year ago. Hadn't I wanted this nice house? Hadn't I loved it? So why was I haunting its halls every night now, howling like Medea? Wasn't I proud of all we'd accumulated? The prestigious home in the Hudson Valley, the apartment in Manhattan, the 8 phone lines, the friends and the picnics and the parties, the weekends spent roaming the aisles of some box-shaped superstore of our choice, buying ever more appliances on credit. I had actively participated in every moment of the creation of this life, so why did I feel like none of it resembled me? Why did I feel so overwhelmed with duty, tired of being the primary breadwinner, and the housekeeper, and the social coordinator, and the dog walker, and the wife, and the soon-to-be mother, and somewhere in my stolen moments, a writer? I don't want to be married anymore. My husband was sleeping in the other room, in our bed. I equal parts loved him and could not stand him. I couldn't wake him to share in my distress. What would be the point? He'd already been watching me fall apart for months now, watching me behave like a mad woman. We both agreed on that word, and I only exhausted him. We both knew there was something wrong with me, and he'd been losing patience with it. We'd been fighting and crying, and we were weary in that way that only a couple whose marriages collapse and can be weary. We had the eyes of refugees. The many reasons I didn't want to be this man's wife anymore are too personal and too sad to share here. Much of it had to do with my problems, but a good portion of our troubles were related to his issues as well. It's only natural. There are always 2 figures in a marriage, after all. 2 votes, 2 opinions, 2 conflicting sets of decisions, desires, and limitations. But I don't think it's appropriate for me to discuss his issues in my book, nor would I ask anyone to believe that I am capable of reporting an unbiased version of our story, and therefore the chronicle of our marriage's failure will remain untold here. I also will not discuss here all the reasons why I did still want to be his wife, or all his wonderfulness, or why I loved him and why I had married him and why I was unable to imagine life without him. I won't open any of that. Let it be sufficient to say that on this night he was still my lighthouse and my albatross in equal measure. The only thing more unthinkable than leaving was staying. The only thing more impossible than staying was leaving. I didn't want to destroy anything or anybody. I just wanted to slip quietly out the back door without causing any fuss or consequences, and then not stop running until I reached Greenland. This part of my story is not a happy one, I know, but I share it here because something was about to occur on that bathroom floor that would change forever the progression of my life. Almost like one of those crazy astronomical super events when a planet flips over in outer space for no reason whatsoever, and its molten core shifts, relocating its poles and altering its shape radically, such that the whole mass of the planet suddenly becomes oblong instead of spherical. Something like that. What happened was that I started to pray, like to God. Now, this is a first for me, and this is the first time I have introduced that loaded word, God, into my book, and since this is a word which will appear many times again throughout these pages, it seems only fair that I pause here for a moment to explain exactly what I mean when I say that word, just so people can decide right away how offended they need to get. Saving for later the argument about whether God exists at all? No, here's a better idea. Let's skip that argument completely. Let me first explain why I use the word God when I could just as easily use the words Jehovah, Allah, Shiva, Brahma, Vishnu, or Zeus. Alternatively, I could call that, which is how the ancient Sanskrit scriptures say it, and which I think comes close to the all-inclusive and unspeakable entity I've sometimes experienced. But that feels impersonal to me, a thing, not a being, and I myself cannot pray to a that. I need a proper name in order to fully sense a personal attendance. For this same reason, when I pray, I do not address my prayers to the universe, the great void, the force, the supreme self, the whole, the creator, the light, the higher power. or even the most poetic manifestation of God's name, taken, I believe, from the Gnostic Gospels, the shadow of the turning. I have nothing against any of these terms. I feel they are all equal because they are all equally adequate and inadequate descriptions of the indescribable. But we each do need a functional name for this indescribability, and God is the name that feels the most warm to me, so that's what I use. I should also confess that I generally refer to God as Him, which doesn't bother me because to my mind it's just a convenient personalizing pronoun, not a precise anatomical description or a cause for revolution. Of course, I don't mind if people call God her, and I understand the urge to do so. Again, to me, these are both equal terms, equally adequate and inadequate. Although I do think the capitalization of either pronoun is a nice touch, a small politeness in the presence of the divine. Culturally, though, not theologically, I'm a Christian. I was born a Protestant of the white Anglo-Saxon persuasion. And while I do love that great teacher of peace who is called Jesus, and while I do reserve the right to ask myself in certain trying situations what indeed he would do, I can't swallow that one fixed rule of Christianity insisting that Christ is the only path to God. Strictly speaking, then, I cannot call myself a Christian. Most of the Christians I know accept my feelings on this with grace and open-mindedness. Then again, most of the Christians I know don't speak very strictly. To those who do speak and think strictly, all I can do here is offer my regrets for any hurt feelings and now excuse myself from their business. Traditionally, I've responded to the transcendent mystics of all religions. I have always responded with breathless excitement to anyone who has ever said that God does not live in a dogmatic scripture or in a distant throne in the sky, but instead abides very close to us indeed, much closer than we can imagine, breathing right through our own hearts. I respond with gratitude to anyone who has ever voyaged to the center of that heart and who has then returned to the world with a report for the rest of us that God is an experience of extreme love. In every religious tradition on earth, there have always been mystical saints and transcendents who report exactly this experience. Unfortunately, many of them have ended up arrested and killed. Still, I think very highly of them. In the end, what I have come to believe about God is simple. It's like this. I used to have this really great dog. She came from the pound. She was a mixture of about 10 different breeds, but seemed to have inherited the finest features of them all. She was brown. When people asked me what kind of dog is that, I would always give the same answer. She's a brown dog. Similarly, when the question is raised, what kind of God do you believe in? My answer is easy. I believe in a magnificent God. Of course, I've had a lot of time to formulate my opinions about divinity since that night on the bathroom floor when I spoke to God directly for the first time. In the middle of that dark November crisis, though, I was not interested in formulating my views on theology. I was interested only in saving my life. I had finally noticed that I seemed to have reached a state of hopeless and life-threatening despair, and it occurred to me that sometimes people in this state will approach God for help. I think I had read that in a book someplace. What I said to God through my gasping sobs was something like this. Hello, God, how are you? I'm Liz. Nice to meet you. That's right. I was speaking to the creator of the universe as though we'd just been introduced at a cocktail party. But we work with what we know in this life, and these are the words I always use at the beginning of a relationship. In fact, it was all I could do to stop myself from saying I've always been a big fan of your work. I'm so sorry to bother you late at night, I continue, but I'm in serious trouble. And I'm sorry I haven't ever spoken to you directly before, but I do hope I have always expressed ample gratitude for all the blessings that you've given me in my life. This thought caused me to sob even harder. God waited me out. I pulled myself together enough to go on. I am not an expert at praying, as you know, but can you please help me? I'm in desperate need of help. I don't know what to do. I need an answer. Please tell me what to do. Please tell me what to do. Please tell me what to do. And so the prayer narrowed itself down to that simple entreaty. Please tell me what to do. Repeated again and again. I don't know how many times I begged. I only know that I begged like someone who is pleading for her life, and the crying went on forever, until, quite abruptly, it stopped. Quite abruptly, I found that I was not crying anymore. I'd stopped crying, in fact, in mid-sob. My misery had been completely vacuumed out of me. I lifted my forehead off the floor and sat up in surprise, wondering if I could now see some great being who had taken my weeping away. But nobody was there. I was just alone. But not really alone either. I was surrounded by something I can only describe as a little pocket of silence. A silence so rare that I didn't want to exhale for fear of scaring it off. I was seamlessly still. I don't know when I'd ever felt such stillness. Then I heard a voice. Please don't be alarmed. It was not an Old Testament Hollywood Charlton Heston voice, nor was it a voice telling me I must build a baseball field in my backyard. It was merely my own voice speaking from within my own self, but this was my voice as I had never heard it before. This was my voice, but perfectly wise, calm, and compassionate. This was what my voice would sound like if I had only ever experienced love and certainty in my life. How can I describe the warmth of affection in that voice, as it gave me the answer that would forever seal my faith in the divine? The voice said, "Go back to bed, Liz." I exhaled. It was so immediately clear that this was the only thing to do. I would not have accepted any other answer. I would not have trusted a great booming voice that said either, "You must divorce your husband," or "You must not divorce your husband," because that's not true wisdom. True wisdom gives the only possible answer at any given moment, and that night, going back to bed was the only possible answer. "Go back to bed," said this omniscient interior voice, "because you don't need to know the final answer right now at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday in November. Go back to bed, because I love you. Go back to bed, because the only thing you need to do for now is get some rest and take good care of yourself until you do know the answer. Go back to bed so that when the tempest comes, you'll be strong enough to deal with it. And the tempest is coming, dear one, very soon, but not tonight. Therefore, go back to bed, Liz." In a way, this little episode had all the hallmarks of a typical Christian conversion experience. The dark night of the soul, the call for help, the responding voice, the sense of transformation. But I would not say that this was a religious conversion for me, not in the traditional manner of being born again or saved. Instead, I would call what happened that night the beginning of a religious conversation. The first words of an open and exploratory dialogue that would ultimately bring me very close to God indeed. If I had any way of knowing that things were, as Lily Tomlin once said, going to get a whole lot worse before they got worse, I'm not sure how well I would have slept that night. But 7 very difficult months later, I did leave my husband. When I finally made that decision, I thought the worst of it was over. This only shows how little I knew about divorce. There was once a cartoon in the New Yorker magazine, 2 women talking, one saying to the other, "If you really want to get to know someone, you have to divorce him." Of course, my experience was the opposite. I would say if you really want to stop knowing someone, you have to divorce him or her. Because this is what happened between me and my husband. I believe that we shocked each other by how swiftly we went from being the people who knew each other best in the world to being a pair of the most mutually incomprehensible strangers who ever lived. At the bottom of that strangeness was the abysmal fact that we were both doing something the other person would never have conceived possible. He never dreamed I would actually leave him, and I never, in my wildest imagination, thought he would make it so difficult for me to go. It was my most sincere belief when I left my husband that we could settle our practical affairs in a few hours with a calculator, some common sense, and a bit of goodwill toward the person we'd once loved. My initial suggestion was that we sell the house and divide all the assets 50-50. It never occurred to me we'd proceed any other way. He didn't find this suggestion fair, so I upped my offer, even suggesting this different kind of 50-50 split. What if he took all the assets and I took all the blame? But not even that offer would bring a settlement. Now it was at a loss. How do you negotiate once you'd offered everything? I could do nothing now but wait for his counterproposal. My guilt at having left him forbade me from thinking I should be allowed to keep even a dime of the money I'd made in the last decade. Moreover, my newfound spirituality made it essential to me that we not battle. So this was my position. I would neither defend myself from him nor would I fight him. For the longest time against the counsel of all who cared about me, I resisted even consulting a lawyer because I considered even that to be an act of war. I wanted to be all Gandhi about this. I wanted to be all Nelson Mandela about this. Not realizing at the time that both Gandhi and Mandela were lawyers. Months passed. My life hung in limbo as I waited to be released, waited to see what the terms would be. We were living separately. He had moved into our Manhattan apartment, but nothing was resolved. Bills piled up, careers stalled, the house fell into ruin, and my husband's silences were broken only by his occasional communications, reminding me what a criminal jerk I was. And then there was David. All the complications and traumas of those ugly divorce years were multiplied by the drama of David, the guy I fell in love with as I was taking leave of my marriage. Did I say that I fell in love with David? What I meant to say is that I dove out of my marriage and into David's arms exactly the same way a cartoon circus performer dives off a high platform and into a small cup of water, vanishing completely. I clung to David for escape from marriage as if he were the last helicopter pulling out of Saigon. I inflicted upon him my every hope for my salvation and happiness, and yes, I did love him. But if I could think of a stronger word than desperately to describe how I loved David, I would use that word here. And desperate love is always the toughest way to do it. I moved right in with David after I left my husband. He is a gorgeous young man. A born New Yorker, an actor, a writer with those brown, liquid-centered Italian eyes that have I already mentioned this? Unstitched me. Street smart, independent, vegetarian, foul-mouthed, spiritual, seductive. A rebel poet yogi from Yonkers. God's own sexy rookie shortstop. Bigger than life, bigger than big. Or at least he was to me. The first time my best friend Susan heard me talking about him, she took one look at the high fever in my face and said to me, "Oh my gosh, baby, you are in so much trouble." David and I met because he was performing in a play based on short stories I'd written. He was playing a character I'd invented, which is somewhat telling. In desperate love, it's always like this, isn't it? In desperate love, we always invent the characters of our partners, demanding that they be what we need of them, and then feeling devastated when they refuse to perform the role we created in the first place. But we had such a great time together during those early months when he was still my romantic hero and I was still his living dream. It was excitement and compatibility like I'd never imagined. We invented our own language. We went on day trips and road trips. We hiked to the top of things, swam to the bottom of other things, planned the journeys across the world we would take together. We had more fun waiting in line at the Department of Motor Vehicles than most couples have on their honeymoons. We gave each other the same nickname, so there would be no separation between us. We made goals, vows, promises, and dinner together. He read books to me, and he did my laundry. The first time that happened, I called Susan to report the marvel and astonishment, like I'd just seen a camel using a payphone. I said, "A man just did my laundry, and he even hand-washed my delicates." And she repeated, "Oh my gosh, baby, you are in so much trouble." The first summer of Liz and David looked like the falling in love montage of every romantic movie you've ever seen, right down to the splashing in the surf and the running hand in hand through the golden meadows at twilight. At this time, I was still thinking my divorce might actually proceed gracefully, though I was giving my husband the summer off from talking about it so we could both cool down. Anyway, it was so easy not to think about all that loss in the midst of such happiness. Then that summer, otherwise known as the reprieve, ended. On September 9, 2001, I met with my husband face-to-face for the last time, not realizing that every future meeting would necessitate lawyers between us to mediate. We had dinner in a restaurant. I tried to talk about our separation, but all we did was fight. He let me know that I was a liar and a traitor, and that he hated me and would never speak to me again. 2 mornings later, I woke up after a troubled night's sleep to find that hijacked airplanes were crashing into the 2 tallest buildings in my city, as everything invincible that had once stood together now became a smoldering avalanche of ruin. I called my husband to make sure he was safe, and we wept together over this disaster, but I did not go to him. During that week, when everyone in New York City dropped animosity in deference to the larger tragedy at hand, I still did not go back to my husband, which is how we both knew it was very, very over. It's not much of an exaggeration to say that I did not sleep again for the next 4 months. I thought I had fallen to bits before, but now, in harmony with the apparent collapse of the entire world, my life really turned to smash. I winch now to think of what I imposed on David during those months we lived together, right after 9/11 and my separation from my husband. Imagine his surprise to discover that the happiest, most confident woman he'd ever met was actually, when you got her alone, a murky hole of bottomless grief. Once again, I could not stop crying. This is when he started to retreat, and that's when I saw the other side of my passionate romantic hero. The David who is solitary as a castaway, cool to the touch, in need of more personal space than a herd of American bison. David's sudden emotional backstepping probably would have been a catastrophe for me, even under the best of circumstances, given that I am the planet's most affectionate life form, something like a cross between a golden retriever and a barnacle. But this was the very worst of circumstances. I was despondent and dependent, needing more care than an armful of premature infant triplets. His withdrawal only made me more needy, and my neediness only advanced his withdrawals, until soon he was retreating under fire of my weeping pleas of, "Where are you going? What happened to us?" Dating tip: men love this. The fact is, I had become addicted to David. In my defense, he had fostered this, being something of a man fatale. And now that his attention was wavering, I was suffering the easily foreseeable consequences. Addiction is the hallmark of every infatuation-based love story. It all begins when the object of your adoration bestows upon you a heady, hallucinogenic dose of something you never even dared to admit you wanted. An emotional speedball, perhaps, of thunderous love and roiling excitement. Soon you start craving that intense attention with the hungry obsession of any junkie. When the drug is withheld, you promptly turn sick, crazy, and depleted, not to mention resentful of a dealer who encouraged this addiction in the first place, but who now refuses to pony up the good stuff anymore, despite the fact that you know he has it hidden somewhere, damn it, because he used to give it to you for free. Next stage finds you skinny and shaking in a corner, certain only that you would sell your soul or rob your neighbors just to have that thing even one more time. Meanwhile, the object of your adoration has now become repulsed by you. He looks at you like you're someone he's never met before, much less someone he once loved with high passion. The irony is you can hardly blame him. I mean, check yourself out. You're a pathetic mess, unrecognizable even to your own eyes. So that's it. You have now reached infatuation's final destination, the complete and merciless devaluation of self. The fact that I can even write calmly about this today is mighty evidence of time's healing powers. because I didn't take it well as it was happening. To be losing David right after the failure of my marriage, and right after the terrorizing of my city, and right during the worst ugliness of divorce. A life experience my friend Brian has compared to, quote, having a really bad car accident every single day for about 2 years, end quote. Well, this simply was too much. David and I continued to have our bouts of fun and compatibility during the days, but at night in his bed, I became the only survivor of the nuclear winter as he visibly retreated from me more every day, as though I were infectious. I came to fear nighttime like it was a torture cellar. I would lie there beside David's beautiful and accessible sleeping body, and I would spin into a panic of loneliness and meticulously detailed suicidal thoughts. Every part of my body pained me. It felt like I was some kind of primitive spring-loaded machine placed under far more tension than it had ever been built to sustain, about to blast apart at great danger to anyone standing nearby. I imagined my body parts flying off my torso in order to escape the volcanic core of unhappiness that had become me. Most mornings, David would wake to find me sleeping fitfully on the floor beside his bed, huddled on a pile of bathroom towels like a dog. What happened now? He would ask, another man thoroughly exhausted by me. I think I lost like 30 pounds during that time.